Jesus tells the famous parable of sorts to end his Sermon on the Mount that says, the wise man builds his house on a rock, and the foolish man builds his house on the sand. And when the storms of life come, the foundation on which the house is built is exposed, so build well. As we've dug into the Sermon on the Mount, we've been asking ourselves, how then do we build our lives well? And this morning, we have another opportunity to sort of zoom in on the teaching of Jesus and look at a particular area of life that is challenging for many, and hopefully, if we look even beyond its depth, to see a broader perspective, a truth of life that is challenging for all of us. So, if you have a copy of the Scriptures, you can turn to Matthew chapter 5. We're going to read Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 through verse 30. This is what Jesus says. As you've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into Gehenna. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into Gehenna. The Word of God for the people of God. Jesus does not mince words, does he? As he's always going to do in this section of the sermon, he's taking a principle from the Torah, the law that governed the Jewish people. We find it in Exodus, but also in Leviticus and Deuteronomy to an extent. And he's going to show that while what was provided for in the Old Covenant or the Old Law was good and important, especially communally, it does not get to the heart of the matter in the kind of way that human beings need in order for a true solution to present itself. And so here, in the same way that last week Jesus said, hey, you heard it said, don't murder anyone. But I tell you, if you call someone a fool or if you say rakah, you're worthless, you've already murdered them. Here Jesus says, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery, but I tell you, if you even look lustfully after a woman, you've already committed adultery in your heart. Now, some of you, just by this opening to this whole sermon, have already decided this doesn't apply to me, I'm checking out. I urge you not to, okay? I'm willing to admit that for some people, this might not be a presenting issue, but I do think as we keep peeling back the layers, you're going to find heart trauma that needs to be dealt with by Jesus. And so stick with me as we move through this. Let's start by saying some obvious things. Adultery is bad. Right? So in the Old Covenant, adultery was bad and wrong and carried with it severe capital penalties. And so in the first century world of Jesus, any religious person of any moral or ethic would look around and say, yeah, you're right, adultery's wrong, we don't do that. Now, at some level, it carries that same kind of moral quality in our society, but not like it did then. And so even for us, as we're looking deeper, we need to pause and remind ourselves, we've got a big problem with just the original presenting question. That is that it matters deeply to God that husbands and wives are sexually faithful to each other. And so it should matter to us, not just personally, but in terms of an ethic for society. Insomuch as the world says that sex is people's choices, we also say that no, sex is a means by which God has called humanity to interact with each other in a particular way for the good of the whole cosmos, not just the individual seeking it. And so, as Christians, we rightly affirm that adultery is wrong. However, we hear this morning that Jesus says, and I tell you, that even if you look lustfully after a woman, you've already committed adultery in your own heart. That is, that Jesus is equating lust and adultery in the same way he equated anger and murder. There's no skipping around this. There's no pastoral special hermeneutics that say, but he really meant. No, he meant what he said. And we need to take it at face value and deal with that honestly this morning. That Jesus is saying adultery, friends, doesn't happen in a vacuum. It comes from somewhere, and its root is lust. And so the minute you step towards it, you have engaged it. And therefore, to simply say, don't do adultery, is not to deal with the presenting problem. And Jesus, by raising the problem, is also raising a solution that we need to pursue this morning as we think about this together. A couple of, I don't want to say disclaimers because it's not a disclaimer, but a couple of reorganizing thoughts, right? So Jesus is speaking to a contextual audience, first century world. Okay? And I'm speaking to a contextual audience, not a first century world. And so it's important for us not to simply make one-to-one characterizations, but to think about the trajectory from then to now. So it seems like in this moment, Jesus is only talking to men. And if you read it that way, I think you would be correct, that he was talking to men. Because in that society, men were the ones who were guilty of this all of the time. Because it was a patriarchal society, because men had power and women didn't have power, and for all of these reasons. That is not the world we live in today. I'm not suggesting to you it's a perfectly equal world. Don't mishear anything I'm saying. But this reality of lust and of adultery and of sexual impropriety is possible no matter your gender. And so we need to grapple with that and understand that and engage that honestly. Additionally, Jesus is speaking to some level of religious people, right? These are people who have gathered to hear a rabbi talk about God-type things, right? He's not showing up at a philosophical conference, i.e. Paul in Athens in Acts 17. So he's speaking to religious people at some level who are holding this code of ethics. And at some level, he's speaking to religious leaders because if you remember, at the beginning of the sermon, he said, you are going to need a righteousness greater than the people who you hold up as religious heroes in your society. The Pharisees, the scribes, the teachers of the law, so forth and so on. So in essence, he is also implying in this moment that for a Pharisee or a religious leader, of course they would never commit adultery, but they would be easily able to overlook lustful acts, thoughts, intentions, etc. Jesus is exposing a reality within a religious world. And I want to say to you today, it's just the same. That we are very careful often to think about sexual sin in terms of external action and not in terms of internal impulse. And in so doing, we misunderstand sexuality from a Christian perspective, and we also misunderstand the means to live sexually in a way that honors and glorifies God. Fair enough? One last reorienting statement. In the first century world of Jesus, lots of things did not exist that do exist now. Things like the internet, things like social media, things like mass marketing. And listen, I am not anti-technology or anti-media. However, as theologians have rightly said, media, technology, whatever advances are not wrong. However, they do multiply what is wrong in our world. And so we now have way more access and, in fact, live in a culture where the ethos of lust has been provoked and stoked to a high place. I would suggest to you that what Jesus is telling to his people then is actually harder for us today than it was for them then. And it's okay to admit that. It does not mean that we can loosen what he says. It means we have to be honest about our situation and think even more thoughtfully about how it applies to us. So Jesus says, listen, if you look lustfully after, he says a woman, but we're going to say another person, okay? If you look lustfully after another person, you've already committed adultery. So the first thing we need to do is attempt to understand, what does he mean by look lustfully? Because there's a continuum of some level, right? And we all want to know what is okay and what is not okay. And inevitably, because we're asking that question, it's the kind of question that people would ask Jesus all the time, and he oftentimes would refuse to answer. Because it's the question of right and wrong is almost always a question of self-justification. What can I do that's okay? As opposed to, no, I have a problem that I need to be dealing with. Jesus asked the second part, not the first part, right? So Peter's saying, how many times do I have to forgive? No, you don't understand. The problem is you have a heart that doesn't want to forgive. Let's deal with that. So your question and my question as an interpreter of Scripture this morning is, what does it mean to look lustfully? When do you cross the line into lustful looking? I think Jesus does provide some context to that here, but I want to be very careful as I nuance this with you, not for you to hear me say, oh, this is okay and that's not okay, but rather for us to hear, as human beings, we stand in danger of all kinds of trouble if left to ourselves and our own devices, unchecked in every way. Make sense? So Jesus says a couple of things here. The first thing he does is he uses a participle, right? So for my English fans, you got excited. For everyone else in the world, you're like, oh no, here we go. Well, you asked me to nuance what lust is, and this is the way we can do it, okay? Jesus uses a participle, and listen, for any writer or speaker anywhere, the words you choose and how you choose them matters in order to convey meaning. He could have chose a particular main verb used in a regular kind of way, but he didn't. He chose a participle to describe ongoing action, right? So the participle is seeing or looking. Blepo is the Greek verb. It's preceded by the ho, the definite Greek article. The one looking is how it reads in the original language, right? The one who is looking, not the one who looks or happens to see. The idea here is not a passing glance. The idea is a ongoing posture. Make sense? But it's not just that. Then it comes with a Greek construction after that, which implies intentionality. The one who is looking in order that he or she might desire another. That's how the original language would translate very literally. So you have two components to this that are important for us to think about. The first is ongoing looking, not just a passing glance. Make sense? The second is continuing to look with an intention to want to do something about it. Right? Now, again, I'm going to give you my disclaimer one more time. I'm not giving you an out. Or, I can do this much. Pastor Adam said, as long as I only look for 20 seconds and not 21. Wrong. But there is a difference between looking at someone and thinking they're pretty and looking at someone lustfully. Right? Exactly what that difference is, I can't exactly parse it out for you, but there is a difference. Right? And I know you all struggle with it when you look at me every Sunday and see my beauty radiate from the front here. Now, God has given me to you because when you look at me, there will be no lust, right? But you get the point. Like, there's this weird Christian sense, like a Pharisaic sense almost, who are like, where's the boundary? We'll put the boundary 3 feet beyond where the boundary is, and we'll be careful to never do it. Jesus says, if you live that way, you're going to always break the rules. Because the problem is a heart issue, not an external action issue. And so if you say, I'm never going to look at anyone for more than 10 seconds and I'll be okay, perhaps, but you'll also be quite socially awkward, right? People will think you're bizarre. I don't know, And you're like, well, Jesus said gouge my eyes out, so we'll get to that in a second. So listen, God looks at the world and thinks it's beautiful, okay? It's not wrong for you to look at your wife or to even see a passing glance of another woman or another man and think that person is handsome or beautiful or whatever. The idea is a fixated look that moves your heart to want to do something about that. Okay? And where that line crosses is probably unique and different, not only for each person, but in every single situation. And so the idea of Jesus is be aware, not don't do. He says, listen, when you get that far, it's as if you've already committed adultery. And the same punishment for the one is the punishment for the other. So what is there to do about it? Well, we need to think even more deeply than this. I mentioned to you just a few moments ago that this is intentionality that leads to desire. And this word desire is really, really important. It doesn't show up in your English translation at all, but the main verb, not the participle, again, English grammarians, the participle describes the main verb. The main verb carries the action. The main verb is not looking, main verb is desiring. Okay? The looking describes the desiring and makes the desiring happen. It's the Greek word epithumeo. Okay? And it's used all the time in the New Testament. And here's the problem, friends. It's used for good things and for bad things. That is that God is fully aware that for human beings, desire is part of who we are. That is that desire is not wrong. But misplaced desire is wrong. And unhealthy desire leads to unhealth and destruction in our lives. See, if adultery is rooted in lust, lust is rooted in desire. And a desire that is unhealthy or unsubdued or given in to the flesh, if we want to talk in deeply spiritual or theological terms. So then we have to ask ourselves the question, where does this come from? How does this happen? Why is this a reality in our world? And as we get into this part, I want to necessarily widen the spectrum, and hopefully you'll take that jump with me to see what I think Jesus is getting after here by using a particular example to make a much bigger point. And every time he does this, whether it's murder this week, last week, adultery this week, divorce next week, you're going to see it's not to make bold and blanket statements about every particular thing. Rather, it is to give an example of an underlying universal human problem that needs to be dealt with and can only be dealt with by Jesus. Fair enough? Okay. So here the issue is desire, unsubdued desire. And all of humanity is created with desire, but desire goes haywire where in Scripture? Genesis 3, right? In Genesis 3, desire in humanity is for things that God has said are not helpful and beneficial for us. And in essence, what happens in Genesis 3 is that human desire breaks out of its subjugation to its creator, saying God knows what's best for me, and therefore I'll desire the things that he's put in front of me, and instead begins to say God doesn't know what's best for me, right? Believes the serpent's lie that says he's not out for my good, he's just keeping things from me. And it goes in a released way towards all kinds of things that lead to all kinds of destruction. And so whether you get to all the way to the New Testament, then you have all kinds of talk about good desire and all kinds of talks about bad desire, oftentimes talking about desire of the spirit and desire of the flesh, right? Because in the New Testament, flesh is bad, spirit is good. And so there's this ongoing battle at the desire level of your soul that is happening all of the time. That is where the Holy Spirit is battling your flesh 24/7. A lot of the time, you are wholly unaware of that vicious and forceful battle that is ongoing. Why, then, as humans, do we give into fleshly desire? Well, I would suggest to you that underneath desire, or wrongful desire, or unhealthy desire, is discontentment. Right? The scriptures talk about this. Is that we give into unhealthy desires because we are not content with what we have. Right? And there's all kinds of realities that go alongside of that, chiefly thinking that God is withholding from us. The same lie that the serpent was feeding Adam and Eve. And so we look at what we have or the situations we're in, we perceive it as lack or as not good enough, and therefore unhealthy desires emerge in other places to go after what we perceive we lack in the midst. And why are we discontent then? We're discontent because at the core soul level, at the very bottom of your soul, the longing that's in your soul is for what the Bible calls peace. Right? The old Hebrew word shalom, which doesn't just mean that, like, you know, your brother and your sister, you're not fighting with them currently. It means that, like, everything is in its right spot in the created world. Everything is functioning in perfect synergy and harmony. You are in your right place and functioning in your right... Like, that is what your soul at its core is longing for. And every misfire in your life is from a lack of peace, which feeds a sense of discontent, which unleashes evil desire, right? Because desire is not bad, but when we're desiring the wrong things, it becomes evil. And then we find ourselves in these circumstances. Now listen, for certain, when Jesus uses the word epithumeo here, he's using it in the context of adultery and lustful ogling or looking. We can't get away from that. However, he could have used another word that specifically talked about sexual intentionality, and he didn't. Why? I think because for him, the core issue is unchecked desire. Unhealthy, unsubdued desire that runs rampant for my kingdom, building for myself on my foundation, as opposed to desire and subjugation to my Lord and Savior, building on His foundation for His kingdom, seeing myself as human in the way that Jesus understands humanity and God as creator designed humanity, not seeing myself as human in the way that sin and death have corrupted humanity and have caused me to pursue things in wrong ways, unhealthy ways, destructive ways that are destructive not just for me, but for all of creation. And so if you've taken that jump with me, now it's not just if you struggle with pornography or if you happen to have an attraction to a coworker or a neighbor. Now it's all of us. Because all of us are lusting after all kinds of things in this world that may not be living things. But it is rooted in an unhealthy desire for something that does rise out of a discontented assessment of your circumstances and situation. That does come from searching for shalom, peace, in the wrong places. Listen to me. If you have a lust problem, you have a gospel problem. What is the gospel, right? The gospel at its core says that Jesus has come to bring peace on earth, right? We celebrate that at Christmas. Almost all of our Christmas songs announce that. Why? Because that was the announcement of the gospel upon Jesus coming. So he's saying necessarily that when you are looking for wholeness, for inner peace at any level, at any place beyond him, you're searching in the wrong way. Therefore, you will come up short and then have discontent, and therefore your human desires that were meant to be spawned and cultivated towards all the good things that God has in this world will be unleashed in bad ways to deal with the discontent because of the wrong pursuit of peace, and you'll find yourself in this mess. This milieu that we all live in, together having created this world that we now look at and think, oh my gosh, yeah, all of our fingerprints are in this. And so Jesus is meaning to expose this level of problem. Not so he can say, see, so you all lose. You're all going to hell. Too bad. No, of course not. He's saying, because the problem is this severe, that's the whole reason I'm here. I'm offering you a rock to build your life on in this hellish world. Choice is yours. I mean, you can go on building your life using the tools of discontent and unsubdued desire, pursuing peace in all the wrong places, sometimes good, even though not ultimate. And as the storms of life come, they leave utter devastation. Or, Jesus says, there's actually another way. There actually is a righteousness that is greater than the Pharisees. There's actually a better gospel than religious people have ever been telling you, right? What do the religious people always tell us? In church today, too. If you do enough good things, God's going to be on your side. And Jesus is saying, let me just open this up and show you who you actually are. Do you think God's going to be on your side? And we're all meant to go, oh, no. And Jesus says, actually, he is. Isn't this amazing? This is who our God is. That in the midst of this mess, he said, this problem is so severe, but I love these people even more than the problem is severe, so I'm going to come and deal with it personally. I'm not just going to give them a law and hope that we can construct a community here. So what does Jesus say? How do we deal with this? Jesus says, listen, if you have this problem, you can't stop looking at the other sex without having a lustful longing. If you can't peruse your Instagram without a lustful longing, if you're spending copious hours on Facebook Marketplace lusting after furniture or whatever, I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to open the floodgates here, right? He says, what you need to do is poke your eyeballs out. So good news, I've brought a blunt object and there's a trash can back here. I'm going to wheel it forward. We're all going to have a come to Jesus moment, right? We'll play Just As I Am. Adam, get ready. 10 to 15 verses. We'll just get you up here. Of course not. Why would Jesus say this? It's a bizarre thing to say. Well, here's the solution. Pluck your eyeballs out. And then if that doesn't work, cut your hands off. Listen, monastic people sometimes did this because they missed the point. They were trying to be what? Religious. Well, we'll follow the rules. We'll do the thing. And then I'll prove to God I'm serious about this. But Jesus has already said the problem is what? Your eyeballs? Your hands? Did he say if you lust after another woman, you've committed adultery in your right eyeball? He didn't say that. He said if you've done this, you've committed adultery with your right hand? He didn't say that. So why cut them out? That's not the point. He's trying to show us the gravity of the situation, while also demonstrating that even if you did that, you would still possess an equal capacity to lust. Because the problem's in your heart, not your eyeballs. The only way to deal with the problem is to pluck your heart out. And guess what? That's exactly what the prophets said would happen when the Messiah came. And that's exactly what Jesus has done for us on the cross. And through his Spirit. We've talked about this as imputed righteousness. That Jesus, for anyone who's joined to him, has given you a new heart. Now we live in the already not yet, right? It's being made new. So I'm not saying, like abracadabra, no more Facebook Marketplace, or no more looking at your coworker or whatever. But I'm saying it is being made new, and therefore you do have the ability to live a new creation life. But most importantly, Jesus has dealt with the problem, the presenting problem, and therefore you can stand before God as one who is wholly clean, even if the record of your last week is filled with this mess. I mean, if that doesn't blow your mind and astonish you, you haven't understood the gospel. If you are not regularly just astonished, even as a Christian of 30, 35, 40, 45, 50 years, at the glory of the gospel, then you're not even beginning to understand it. This is what Jesus has done. This is stunning. And so how do we respond to imputed righteousness then? It's easy. Poke out your eyeballs and cut off your hands. You say, well, you didn't mean that. Yeah, he didn't mean that, but he kind of did. And here's how he meant it. Poke out your fleshly eyeballs and replace them with spiritual eyeballs. Not literally, right? I don't have a spiritual eyeball for sale for you this morning. Figuratively. This is what the Apostle Paul says to all of his churches almost all the time. Take off the old self and put on the new self, friends. It's available to you. It's already not yet. It's going to be imperfect, but you have that ability. And so, in the midst of a world in which lust has been stirred up to an epic place, how do you and I live in this world? How can we practically poke out our eyeballs and cut off our hands? Let me give you 3 things. This is not the end-all, be-all, and these are going to be super 30,000-foot things. Part of the whole gospel thing is your problems are unique. The gospel is big enough, but the application of the gospel is going to be unique for you as well. That's why we need community. That's why we need intentionality. That's why we need lots of gospel saturation. The first thing is run. Run as fast as you can, right? If you perceive you are caught in the grip of lust and there's almost nothing you can do about it, get out of Dodge, right? Look nowhere other than the story in the Old Testament of Joseph and Potiphar's wife to understand that sometimes running is the right response. You are not as strong as you think you are to overcome the temptations that sometimes face you. It is not weak to run. It is spiritual to run. Now, if you're just going to run and never deal with the issues, well, there is a point 2 and a point 3 to be made here. But sometimes you just need to run. So let me give you some practical examples about running, right? Sometimes running means knowing what channels you can't just flip through on the TV. Right? Sometimes running means you know which way home is safe and which way home is not safe based on billboards, signage, people, whatever, I'm just talking in terms of sexual lust right now. And in the broader scopes of lust, you know the times and the seasons where you can be on Instagram or Facebook or Marketplace. You know what's good for your soul in terms of window shopping or whatever else, Sometimes it's okay to be in those places, and sometimes it is not. And if you find yourself there when it is not, run. And tell people around you some of your hot spots so you can sometimes just text somebody and be like, I'm running. And they can walk and stand with you. There is nothing weak about running. But if and when possible, stop. So it's as easy as that? Yeah, it is as easy as that. Paul says it to the Corinthians. I'm going to keep bringing this up. It says to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 10, take every thought captive to Christ. It's not stop thinking. It's like, okay, here it is. Stop, take it captive to Christ in that moment. And process it through a whole different lens. We have that ability because we have the Spirit of God in us. But the third thing that we need to be doing all of the time, whether we can do it in the moment or whether we've got to run and then do it after the fact, is we need to apply the gospel to our heart. It is not just a creed that we believe to be true. It is a new way of living that we're called into. Jesus is Lord, I am not. Jesus brings peace, these other things do not. I'm whole when I am in Christ, not when I'm after all these other things. And so the application of the gospel to your heart does some thinking, right? And it asks the question, what am I desiring here? And why am I desiring it? You need to be in a safe spot to ask these questions, right? And then you ask the next level question. Where is the discontent in my life that is feeding this unhealthy desire? And then you ask the next question down. Where am I wrongly looking for peace that is feeding this discontent? I've talked to plenty of people, married people, discontent in their marriage that leads them into sexual danger and promiscuity. Oftentimes, men and women, husbands and wives, are looking for in their spouse what only Christ can give them. The problem is probably not your wife. It's probably not your husband. Though, listen, we're all human, so they participate in the problem. The problem is your heart. And it's wrong pursuit of wholeness. Can I tell you a couple of things as I finish this morning? Sex is good. I especially want to talk to teenagers if you're in the room right now, right? Because when I was your age and in the church, sex was treated as almost evil. And I understand why. Because parents in the church were trying to keep young people out of the dangers of promiscuity. But what happens because of that is because sex carries a label of evilness into adulthood and we misunderstand it. The problem is not sex. The problem is my heart. Parents, as you're talking to your teenagers and helping them understand sexuality and humanity, I pray that you're talking to them about their hearts, not just about actions. Does it matter that you're not sexually promiscuous? Of course it does. But it doesn't matter if you're not dealing with the problem of your heart. We can't just cower in fear to the big bad world out there. We have to cower in fear to the big bad world in here. Find the gospel and learn how to live in confidence on the foundation that Jesus calls us to build in. Now listen, I'm not telling you how to parent. I'm not telling you any of that stuff. I'm just saying you can read the Bible and understand, no, not only is sex good, God created it. It's part of his whole, the problem isn't sexual desire. The problem is unsubdued and unhinged sexual desire that is coming from a place of discontentment, that is coming from a place of mispursued peace. How I wish that my youth pastor and my parents were talking to me about those issues and not just what's bad. We need the what's bad, but we need this too. God has rightly placed desires in us. Desires are not evil. But desiring the wrong thing is. And desiring it in the wrong way is. And Jesus, as he likes to do, especially to religious people like us, likes to just dig a little deeper. Because we have a tendency to say, oh, that's their problem. That's not my problem. They're the adulterers. But Jesus is like, can we just take an honest look at your heart? You've got a big problem. The good news is that Jesus has an abundance of grace that is far greater than the depth of the brokenness of our hearts. And a grace upon which he calls us to build our very lives. You remember that this whole sermon started off, not this one today, but the Jesus sermon, the official sermon that we're talking about, with identity statements. You are to be salt and light in this world. Imagine if a whole bunch of Christians started not tabooing desire, but living with desire fully fulfilled in Jesus and rightly connected to the people around us, demonstrating to everyone what community and society are meant to look like. This is your mission. God has said, I choose you in that neck of the woods to be salt and light. Imperfect 100%, but with intentionality. So that those around you might see your good works and glorify your God who is in heaven. You pray with me?